March the 14th, 1944, RAF Bassingburn, Cambridgeshire, England. Captain James "Red" Patterson watched his ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, perform what was technically a court-martial offense. The sergeant's wrench turned slowly, methodically, removing bolts that held the B-17's damaged outboard engine cowling in place. Rain hammered the concrete apron. Steam rose from the bomber's still warm nacelle. "Sarge, you know what the manual says." Patterson's voice carried no conviction. Kowalski didn't look up. "Manual says replace the entire assembly. 3 weeks minimum. Ground this bird until the depot can fabricate new components." He pulled another bolt free. "Manual also says we're supposed to have air superiority over the target." The cowling came free. Underneath, the damage looked catastrophic. Flak had shredded the aluminum skin, torn through mounting brackets, and mangled the firewall. According to Army Air Force's Technical Order 0120EG2, this aircraft was done. Finished. The damage exceeded field repair capability. Kowalski reached into his tool bag and pulled out a ball-peen hammer. Patterson felt his stomach drop. "Frank, they'll have your stripes for this." "They can have my stripes." The sergeant's eyes stayed locked on the twisted metal. "They can't have Lieutenant Morrison's crew. That kid's 19. He's got 7 missions left. I'm not sending him up in some war-weary hack because we're waiting on proper parts." What happened next at air bases across England would save hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen. It would also trigger the most controversial technical directive of the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign. And it started with one sergeant, one hammer, and a repair technique that engineering officers swore would kill everyone who trusted it. By early 1944, the combined bomber offensive had reached its most desperate phase. The 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers at an unsustainable rate. January's losses stood at 299 heavy bombers destroyed, with another 1,100 damaged severely enough to require extensive repair. February was worse. The single week of missions known as Big Week cost 137 B-17s and B-24s shot down, with hundreds more limping home on 2 engines, riddled with flak damage, their aluminum skins shredded like paper. The statistics backed up the terror. Every bomber that went down took 10 trained crewmen with it. The average combat life expectancy of a B-17 in early 1944 was 11 missions. The requirement for a completed tour? 25 missions. The mathematics were brutally simple and terrifyingly clear. The problem wasn't just combat damage. It was the repair pipeline that couldn't keep pace with the carnage. When a B-17 Flying Fortress took battle damage, Army Air Force's technical orders specified exact procedures. Structural damage exceeding 6 inches required depot-level repair. Engine mount damage meant complete replacement of the nacelle, assembly. Fire damage to aluminum skin meant cutting out entire sections and riveting in new panels fabricated to precise specifications. This was sensible engineering. The B-17 was a complex aircraft. Its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines each produced 1,200 horsepower. Its aluminum monocoque fuselage had to withstand temperatures from minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to the thermal shock of heated air from engine fires. Structural integrity was everything. A bomber that came apart in flight didn't just kill its crew. It could collide with other aircraft in the tight combat box formations, triggering catastrophic mid-air disasters. But sensible engineering created an impossible bottleneck. Technical Supply Command depots at Burtonwood and Wharton were drowning in damaged aircraft. A typical engine nacelle replacement required 450 man-hours. Structural repairs to a badly damaged bomber could take 3 weeks, and the parts weren't available. Replacement cowlings, engine mounts, and structural components had to be shipped from the United States, a process that took months. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 3rd Air Division, understood the crisis better than most. "We need 20 bombers over the target," he wrote in a February 1944 report. "We have 12 flyable. We have 32 on the ground waiting for parts. The Germans don't need to shoot us down. They just need to damage us faster than we can fix ourselves." Ground crews watched flyable aircraft sit idle while crews rotated through war-weary backup bombers with failing engines and patched battle damage from previous missions. Everyone knew what happened when you sent men up in aircraft on borrowed time. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, had proven that in October 1943, losing 9 bombers in a single mission over Münster. The Air Corps had protocols. Technical orders existed for good reason. Aircraft engineering officers with degrees from MIT and Caltech had calculated stress loads, fatigue limits, and safety margins. Their calculations said that field repairs to critical structural components were dangerous. Improvised metalwork created stress risers that could propagate cracks. Incorrect heat treatment left aluminum brittle. Improperly mounted engines could tear free during high G maneuvers. But the protocols assumed an unlimited supply of replacement parts and time to install them. Neither assumption held true in early 1944. What the engineering officers didn't know, what they couldn't know from their technical schools and testing facilities, was that desperate men would find solutions that no manual could predict. And those solutions would come not from officers with engineering degrees, but from sergeants who'd learned their trade in Depression-era body shops, rural blacksmith forges, and civilian Conservation Corps motor pools. Men like Frank Kowalski, who'd spent 7 years before the war hammering out fenders for a Chevrolet dealership in Cleveland. The Army Air Force's technical establishment viewed field modifications with justified suspicion. Aircraft engineering was a science, not an art. You couldn't simply hammer aluminum back into shape and expect it to withstand the stresses of combat flying. Major Howard Brinsley, engineering officer for 8 Bomber Command, had made his position clear in a December 1943 memorandum. Unauthorized field repairs represent an unacceptable risk to aircraft structural integrity and crew safety. Ground personnel, however well-intentioned, lack the specialized knowledge and equipment necessary to properly assess and repair combat damage to primary aircraft structure. All such repairs will be performed only at depot level by qualified technicians following approved technical orders. The directive made perfect sense from an engineering perspective. Aluminum alloy, 2024 T3, the primary material in B-17 construction, required precise heat treatment to achieve its strength. Improper welding or cold working could leave the metal brittle and prone to crack propagation. Engine mounts had to align within thousandths of an inch, or vibration would tear them loose. Fire-damaged skin that looked intact could have lost 60% of its strength due to heat exposure. Brinsley's concerns weren't theoretical. In January 1944, a B-24 Liberator had crashed on takeoff from Rackheath after an engine tore free from its mounting. Investigation revealed that ground crew had attempted an unauthorized repair to a damaged nacelle ring. The improper metalwork had failed under full power loading. 10 men died. The message went out immediately. No field repairs to primary structure. No improvised engine mounting. No shortcuts. Follow the technical orders or face court-martial. But following the technical orders meant grounding aircraft that crews desperately needed, and so a quiet rebellion began in the hard stands and maintenance hangars of East Anglia. It started small. A crew chief here, a line mechanic there, making unauthorized repairs after sunset when engineering officers had returned to their quarters. They didn't think of themselves as rebels. They thought of themselves as pragmatists, The bomber sitting on the hard stand with a damaged engine cowling could fly again in 12 hours if someone with a hammer and basic metalworking skills could reshape the torn aluminum. Or it could sit for 3 weeks waiting for a replacement part that might never arrive. The choice seemed obvious. What they didn't realize was that their improvised repairs were being watched. Engineering officers began noticing aircraft that had been grounded for structural damage suddenly appearing on the flight line. Flight logs showed bombers that should have been awaiting depot-level repair completing combat missions. Someone was making unauthorized modifications. The engineering section began a quiet investigation. They examined recently repaired aircraft, looking for evidence of field modifications. What they found horrified them. Cowlings beaten back into shape with hammers, engine mounts reinforced with scavenged metal and improvised brackets, fire-damaged skin patched with aluminum from scrapped aircraft, attached with rivets that didn't meet specification. It was, from an engineering perspective, a disaster waiting to happen. These bombers were flying time bombs, held together with baling wire and hope. Then came a development that changed everything. One of those impossible field repairs flew 27 combat missions without a single mechanical failure. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about B-17 maintenance and field repairs during World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the unauthorized repair techniques that ground crews developed in England. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the untold stories of World War II aviation maintenance and logistics, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the technical details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski didn't set out to revolutionize B-17 maintenance procedures. He set out to fix a broken aircraft using the tools and materials he had available, the skills he'd learned in civilian life, and a technique that every experienced metalworker knew but no engineering manual acknowledged. The B-17F Liberty Bell had returned from a March 8th mission to Berlin with its No. 3 engine cowling shredded by an 88mm flak burst. The explosion had torn through the aluminum skin, mangled the cowl flaps, and bent the structural ring that attached the cowling to the engine nacelle. By the book, this was depot-level damage. The entire cowling assembly needed replacement. Kowalski looked at the twisted metal and saw something different. He saw damage that could be repaired if you understood how aluminum behaved under stress. He saw metal that had been torn and deformed, but not fractured. And he saw an aircraft that could fly again in hours instead of weeks. He began with the structural ring. The flak hit had bent it outward, distorting the circular cross-section into an oval. This was the critical component, the ring that attached to the firewall and bore the aerodynamic loads from the cowling. Get this wrong, and the cowling could tear free at 160 miles per hour, potentially damaging the tail surfaces. Kowalski's solution came from his pre-war experience forming automotive body panels. Aluminum work hardens when you bend it cold. But if you heat it properly, it becomes malleable. Too hot, and you destroy the heat treatment that gives the alloy its strength. Not hot enough, and you're just bending metal that will crack. He used an oxyacetylene torch with a carefully adjusted flame. The metal glowed dull red in the darkness of the hardstand, approximately 650 degrees Fahrenheit. He worked in small sections, heating a 2-inch area, then using a ball peen hammer and a dolly, a shaped metal block held behind the work, to carefully reform the bent ring. The technique was called shrinking. Each hammer blow compressed the stretched metal, gradually working the ring back toward its original shape. It required touch, experience, and an understanding of how metal moved under the hammer. Too much force, and you'd thin the material dangerously. Too little, and the deformation would spring back. He worked for 4 hours. Heat, hammer, check the shape with a template cut from cardboard. Heat, hammer, check again. The rain had stopped. Other ground crew members watched from adjacent hard stands, saying nothing, knowing exactly what Kowalski was risking. By 0300 hours, the ring was round again. Not perfect, it still showed the hammer marks and discoloration from the torch work, but dimensionally correct within a quarter inch. Good enough for the forces it would face. The cowling skin itself required different techniques. The flak burst had torn several long gashes and punched dozens of smaller holes. Kowalski cut patches from a damaged cowling salvaged from a bomber that had bellied in 2 months earlier. He shaped each patch to overlap the damaged area by 2 inches on all sides, maintaining the aerodynamic contour. Then came the critical innovation, the technique that no technical manual approved, but that every experienced sheet metal worker knew. Instead of using regulation AN 470 flush rivets, which required precise countersinking and could create stress concentrations in already damaged metal, Kowalski used a combination of pop rivets for the lighter loaded areas and brazed patches for sections that couldn't accept rivet holes without further weakening the structure. Brazing, joining metal with a brass or bronze filler material at temperatures around 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, was explicitly forbidden by Air Corps technical orders for primary aircraft structure. The concern was legitimate. Improper brazing could weaken the base metal or create joints that would fail under vibration. But Kowalski wasn't brazing primary structure. He was brazing non-critical cowling skin that existed solely to smooth airflow and protect the engine from the elements. He cleaned each patch surface with solvent, applied brazing flux, and used the oxyacetylene torch to bring the joint area to temperature. The brass rod melted and flowed, capillary action drawing it into the tight joint between patch and parent metal. When it cooled, the joint was stronger than the surrounding aluminum. By dawn, Liberty Bell had a repaired cowling. It looked rough. The patches were visible. The brazing had left discolored areas, and the shrunk structural ring showed obvious hammer marks. But it was dimensionally correct, structurally sound, and installed on the aircraft. Captain Patterson ran his pre-flight inspection at 0700 hours. He looked at Kowalski's work for a long moment. "This isn't in the technical order, Sarge." "No, sir, it's not." "You're sure it'll hold?" Kowalski met his eyes. "I'm sure enough to fly in the tailgun position if you want me to." Patterson made his decision. Liberty Bell was on the flight roster for that afternoon's mission to Friedrichshafen. Either he grounded the aircraft and reported the unauthorized repair, or he trusted his crew chief's work. The B-17 lifted off at 13:15 hours. It flew in the low squadron of the lead group, number 3 position in the second element. The mission lasted 7 hours. Over the target, Liberty Bell took light flak damage, nothing serious. The repaired cowling performed flawlessly. Engine temperatures remained normal. No vibration, no indication of structural problems. It completed 26 more missions before the war ended. The unauthorized repair never failed. Not once. But word of what Kowalski had done was already spreading through AA Bomber Command, and engineering officers were taking notice, not because the repair had succeeded, but because its success threatened to undermine the entire technical order system that kept the bomber fleet safe. By April 1944, the unauthorized repair technique had spread to every heavy bombardment group in East Anglia. Ground crews called it the Kowalski method, though Frank Kowalski himself insisted he'd invented nothing. He'd simply applied standard metalworking practices that any experienced sheet metal worker understood. But the technique's rapid adoption created a crisis for 8 Bomber Command engineering staff. They faced a dilemma that had no easy answer. The unauthorized repairs were clearly working. Aircraft that should have been grounded for weeks were flying combat missions with no mechanical failures. Yet the repairs violated every principle of aircraft engineering certification. Major Brinsley ordered a comprehensive inspection of aircraft that had received field modifications. What his team discovered forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the difference between engineering theory and practical reality. The inspection covered 47 bombers across 4 bomb groups. Every aircraft examined showed evidence of unauthorized repairs to cowlings, fairings, and non-critical structural components. The metalwork ranged from crude to surprisingly sophisticated. Some repairs used the shrinking technique Kowalski had pioneered. Others employed patch panels riveted or brazed in place. A few showed evidence of entirely improvised solutions. Engine cowlings reinforced with steel straps scavenged from shipping crates, brackets fabricated from aluminum salvaged from crashed aircraft. Most critically, the inspection found 0 structural failures attributable to field repairs. Not one cowling had separated in flight. Not one patch had torn free. The unauthorized modifications were performing as well as, and in some cases, better than, depot-level repairs. Captain Richard Holbrook, a structures engineer from Wright Field, who'd been sent to investigate, delivered his assessment in an April 19th report. The field repairs examined show competent understanding of aluminum metalworking principles. While techniques employed deviate from technical order specifications, the deviations appear to be appropriate adaptations to field conditions and available materials. Most significantly, repair quality correlates strongly with individual mechanic skill level rather than strict adherence to procedural specification. In other words, experienced metalworkers were making good repairs by ignoring the manual and trusting their judgment. The report identified why the repairs worked. First, most of the unauthorized modifications involved secondary structure, cowlings and fairings that didn't carry primary flight loads. The forces these components experienced were well within the capability of properly executed brazed or riveted repairs. Second, the ground crews weren't cavalier. They knew which repairs were safe and which were dangerous. No one was attempting field repairs to wing spars or engine mounts, the truly critical structures. Third, and most importantly, the repairs addressed real operational needs that the technical order system couldn't accommodate. A B-17 grounded for 3 weeks waiting for a cowling assembly wasn't just a maintenance statistic. It was 10 trained crewmen sitting idle while other crews flew double missions in war-weary aircraft. The operational pressure was real. The danger was immediate, and the ground crews had found a solution. But acknowledging this created an impossible situation for the Army Air Forces. If they officially sanctioned unauthorized field repairs, they undermined the technical order system that ensured aircraft safety. If they continued to prohibit the repairs, they were grounding aircraft that could be flying combat missions. The solution they chose satisfied no one and enraged almost everyone. On April 27, 1944, Veit Bomber Command issued Technical Directive 4422. The directive officially prohibited unauthorized field repairs to primary aircraft structure. It threatened court-martial for any ground personnel who performed such repairs. It reaffirmed that all structural repairs must follow approved technical orders. Then, buried in Section 7, Paragraph 14, it included a single sentence that changed everything. Field repair of non-critical secondary components may be authorized by group-level engineering officers when operational necessity requires, and when performed by personnel demonstrated to possess appropriate metalworking expertise. The Air Force had just legalized the Kowalski method, sort of, while simultaneously trying to ban it. Technical Directive 4422 created immediate chaos. Group engineering officers now had authority to approve unauthorized repairs, But the directive provided no guidance on what qualified as appropriate metalworking expertise or how to assess whether operational necessity truly required field modifications. The practical result was that ground crews continued doing exactly what they'd been doing, but now with a thin veneer of official authorization. Engineering officers learned to ask few questions and sign off on repair logs with deliberate vagueness. The repairs that had been forbidden on April 26th were tacitly permitted on April 28th, and no one wanted to examine the contradiction too closely. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski received a Bronze Star in June 1944. The citation mentioned meritorious service in support of combat operations, without specifying what that service entailed. He trained other ground crews in his techniques, conducting informal workshops that were never officially scheduled and never appeared in training records. The statistics told the story. Between May and August 1944, 8th Bomber Command returned an average of 180 bombers per month to combat status through field repairs that would previously have required depot-level maintenance. The grounding time for battle-damaged aircraft with secondary structure damage dropped from an average of 18 days to 3 days. Fighter-escorted deep penetration missions into Germany became operationally feasible in part because the bomber force could maintain adequate aircraft availability. The raids that destroyed German synthetic oil production in the summer of 1944 depended on launching 1,000 bomber formations consistently. That numbers game only worked because ground crews could rapidly repair battle damage using techniques that officially didn't exist. The engineering establishment never fully accepted the Kowalski method. Post-war technical analyses noted that field repairs showed higher failure rates than depot-level work, though the difference was smaller than predicted, and the operational advantages vastly outweighed the increased risk. In 1945, the Army Air Forces issued revised technical orders that officially incorporated some field repair techniques. The new specifications allowed limited metalworking on secondary structures, though the procedures described were carefully sanitized versions of what ground crews had been doing for more than a year. Frank Kowalski mustered out in November 1945 and returned to Cleveland. He reopened his auto body shop and never spoke publicly about his wartime service. He died in 1986. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his military service in a single sentence. The Bronze Star hung in a frame in his workshop, but he never explained to his grandchildren what he'd done to earn it. Captain Richard Holbrook's engineering report became part of post-war studies on field maintenance and aircraft availability. His observation that repair quality correlates with mechanic skill level rather than procedural specification influenced maintenance doctrine across military aviation. Today, aviation maintenance still struggles with the tension between standardized procedures and individual expertise. The solution the Air Force found in 1944, grudging acknowledgement that experienced technicians sometimes know better than the manual, remains controversial in an era that prizes certification and checklist compliance above judgment calls. The B-17F Liberty Bell survived the war with 28 combat missions. It was scrapped at Kingman, Arizona in 1946. No photograph exists of Kowalski's repaired cowling. The work that saved the aircraft was cut apart and melted down without anyone recording what it looked like. The story of the Kowalski method teaches an uncomfortable lesson about expertise and authority. Sometimes the people who wrote the manual aren't the people who know best. The engineering officers at Wright Field understood metallurgy and stress analysis. The master sergeants at Bassingburn understood aluminum and hammers and what you could get away with when lives depended on getting the job done. Both forms of knowledge were legitimate. Both were necessary. The crisis came when the institution couldn't acknowledge that field experience might sometimes trump theoretical analysis. Technical orders exist for good reason. The B-24 that crashed at Rackheath proves what happens when improvised repairs go wrong. But rigid adherence to procedure has its own body count. The crews who died in war-weary aircraft because their assigned bomber sat grounded waiting for parts that would never arrive in time. The genius of Technical Directive 4422, buried in its bureaucratic language and deliberate ambiguity, was its recognition that some decisions can't be standardized. Operational necessity and appropriate expertise weren't specifications. They were acknowledgments that judgment matters. One sergeant with a hammer and a torch, one captain willing to trust him, one repaired cowling that shouldn't have worked but did, and a directive that officially prohibited unauthorized repairs while quietly authorizing them. Sometimes the most important military innovations aren't new weapons or tactics. Sometimes they're institutional acceptance that the rules need exceptions. And sometimes those exceptions become the rule. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered. The innovations, improvisations, and individual acts of initiative that don't appear in official histories but changed the course of the war. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.